There's a story my grandfather never finished telling. He'd get to a certain part, the part where the woman stood over him with a knife and said something in a language he didn't know yet, and he'd stop, set down his coffee, look out the window at whatever was blowing across the flats. And then he'd say, "Some things don't translate, boy," and that was the end of it. I used to think he was protecting me from something violent, something shameful, maybe, the kind of frontier ugliness men of his generation swallowed whole and never spoke of. It took me 30 years and a leather-bound journal, found in a cedar chest that smelled of pine tar and dried sage, to understand what he was really protecting. Himself, from the grief of remembering something beautiful that he had been forced to leave. What follows is his account. His words where I could keep them, mine where the ink had faded past reading. I have changed nothing of substance. I have softened nothing. He would not have wanted me to. The first thing I noticed, before the pain, before the fear, before any coherent thought assembled itself in my skull, was the smell of juniper smoke. It is a strange thing, the mind under duress. It bypasses the useful and reaches for the sensory. I was lying face down in red dirt with my wrists bound behind me and my left shoulder screaming from a fall I couldn't fully remember, and what occupied my attention in those first swimming seconds of consciousness was smoke. The way it threaded through the air above me, slow and gray-blue, curling like something alive and unbothered. My name is Caleb Rourke. I was 26 years old. I had been riding fence line for the Harmon Ranch for 3 years, and I had never been captured by anyone in my life. And for a span of perhaps 4 heartbeats, I was absolutely certain I was dead, and this was whatever came after. Then someone stepped on my hand. Not maliciously, not with intent, just stepped on it, the heel of a moccasin pressing my knuckles into the gravel with the casual indifference of a person crossing a floor. I gasped. My head came up. The world swiveled and righted itself badly. A camp small, maybe 20 people in my immediate field of vision, though I had the distinct impression of more beyond the tree line at the edge of what appeared to be a shallow arroyo. Brush wickiups, some with hide covers drawn back against the heat. Dogs, 3 that I could count, who regarded me with professional suspicion. Horses picketed along a rope line, 8 or 10 of them, which told me these were people who moved fast and intended to keep moving. I knew enough to know I was in Apache territory. Every man who rode the southern ranges knew it. You felt it before you saw it, a quality of attention in the landscape, a sense that the juniper and mesquite and broken rock were watching you with purposes of their own. My horse had spooked at something 2 days east of here, thrown me into a dry wash, and when I'd finally climbed out with blood in my mouth and a ringing in my ears, the horse was gone, and so, apparently, was my ability to make good decisions, because I had walked west when I should have walked east. I had been walking for the better part of a day when they found me, or perhaps I should say, when they let me find them. There is a difference, and I understood it only later. Someone crouched in front of my face. I blinked. A man middle-aged with a broad face and an expression that conveyed neither hostility nor welcome, merely assessment. He studied me the way you study a horse you're considering buying, looking for lameness, for dangerous habit. His eyes moved over my face, my shoulders, my bound wrists, and then he said something over his shoulder and stood and walked away. I was, apparently, not interesting enough to warrant continued attention. This was, I would learn, both an insult and the greatest mercy anyone had shown me in years. They gave me water before nightfall, not generously. A clay vessel passed to me by a boy of perhaps 10 who set it down in the dirt beside me with the expression of someone performing a chore he found tedious. I had to lower my face to drink, which was humiliating in the specific way that only the very practical can be humiliating. Not theatrical, not cruel, just, here is your reduced circumstance, drink from it. I drank. The water tasted of the earth and something mineral I couldn't name, and it was the best thing I had ever put in my body. The boy watched me drink. When I lifted my face, he was still there, arms crossed, regarding me with solemn curiosity. I said in Spanish, because it was the only secondary language I had, picked up from vaqueros on the Harmon, "Thank you." He blinked, said something back in Apache, then turned and ran. I catalogued what I could see from my position. My wrists were bound with rawhide to a stake driven into the hard ground, not cruelly, not too tight, but with the confidence of people who knew exactly how much restraint was necessary and weren't interested in inflicting more than that. My boots were still on, which I took as a modest positive sign. My gun, my knife, and my hat were gone. My shirt had been cut open at the left shoulder. At some point someone had examined the injury there, because the area had been cleaned and smelled faintly of something herbal, something astringent. Someone had tended my wound. I couldn't decide what to do with that information, so I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile whose purpose you haven't yet worked out. She came to me at dusk. I heard her before I saw her, not footsteps exactly, more a quality of intentional movement that distinguished itself from the general sounds of the camp. A woman's footfall is different from a man's, and different again from a child's, and I had spent enough time in rough country to read approaching sound the way some men read weather. She came around the edge of a brush screen and stopped maybe 6 feet from me, and I had a moment, just a moment, where my mind simply went quiet. She was perhaps 22 or 23, dark hair braided severely back, a face that was not beautiful in any way I would have been able to articulate to another man at that time, but which had a quality that I can only describe, looking back across decades, as presence. She occupied her own face completely. There was no performance in it, no arrangement for my benefit or anyone else's. She was simply there, fully, the way a hawk is fully there or a thunderhead. She carried a bowl of something that smelled of meat and something sharp, possibly chilies. She set it down in front of me, stood back, watched. I looked at the bowl. Looked at her, looked at my bound wrists. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal, and then she crouched and untied my right hand, just the one, left the other still secured to the stake. Then she stood back again and waited. The message was clear: eat, but don't think this makes you free. I ate. My right hand was shaking in a way I chose to attribute entirely to hunger. The food was better than anything I had eaten in 3 weeks of range cooking. Some kind of venison stew, thick, with roots I couldn't identify, warmth that moved through me like slow fire. She watched me eat with the same professional detachment as the older man had assessed me earlier. Not unkind, not warm, simply watchful. When I finished, she took the bowl, retied my wrist. And then, before she left, she did something that I have never stopped thinking about. She paused, tilted her head, and said in English not fluent, not effortless, but absolutely deliberate, "You walk wrong." Then she left. "You walk wrong." I turned it over through the night, which was cold in the way that high desert nights are cold. Sudden, total, the heat of the day replaced so completely it was hard to believe they were the same country. I had no blanket. I curled as best I could toward the warmth of the steak, which was foolish and didn't work, and I thought about what she had meant. I settled, finally, on the most literal interpretation. I had been walking west when I should have been walking east, and she or someone had seen me walking, and they had known from my direction and my pace, and probably a dozen other signals I wasn't even aware of generating, that I was lost, and alone, and walking toward nothing. "You walk wrong." It stayed with me, not as an insult, as a fact that contained more information than it seemed to. The second day, the older man, I named him, privately, the assessor, came to me in the morning and asked me questions. He had more Spanish than I'd expected, rough and idiomatic, and between his Spanish and my Spanish and a considerable amount of gesture, we managed a halting exchange. He wanted to know if I was alone. I said yes. He wanted to know where I had come from. I told him the Harmon Ranch, east. He knew the name. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. He wanted to know if anyone would come looking. I thought about Harmon, who was a decent man, but not a sentimental one. I thought about the other hands, good men, overworked men, men with their own fence lines to ride. I thought about how many cowboys disappeared into the southern ranges every year and were not found until spring, if they were found at all. "No," I said, "not soon." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already decided. He went away. She came back. Her name, the name she eventually told me, though not for several days, was Naylin. I learned this the way I learned most things about her. By accident, by observation, by the patient accumulation of detail she never volunteered but never actively withheld. On the second day she brought me food again, and again untied one hand, and this time she stayed while I ate, sitting cross-legged at a distance with something in her lap that she was working with her hands, braiding, I thought, though I couldn't see clearly. I said in Spanish, "What is your name?" She said nothing. I tried in English. Your name, what do people call you? She looked up from her braiding, looked at me with an expression that I would eventually understand meant. That is a question with a complicated answer, and I have not decided yet whether you've earned the complicated answer. I'm Caleb's, I offered. Caleb Rourke. Caleb, she said, testing it, nodded once as if filing it. Then went back to her braiding. I watched the camp the way I always watched things I didn't understand, with the particular attention of someone who knew that understanding might be the difference between living and not. I had always been a watcher. My mother called it my best quality and my worst habit simultaneously, which I think was the most accurate thing she ever said about me. These were Chiricahua, I was fairly certain, though I had no deep knowledge to confirm it. A band of perhaps 35 or 40 people, including children and elders. They moved with an efficiency that was almost architectural. Every action nested inside another action, nothing wasted. When they broke camp, which they did on my third morning there, they did it in under an hour. 35 people and their entire domestic world, folded and loaded and gone. I was moved with them, tied to a horse, not unkindly, just efficiently, and led along at a pace that suggested they were not particularly worried about me escaping on horseback, which was probably correct given that I had no idea where I was. Naylin rode near the front. I noticed this because I noticed everything about her, which was not sentimentality but survival. She had been the one person who had spoken to me in any language I partially understood, which made her my primary intelligence source, which made watching her a practical necessity. She was a confident rider, not showy, the opposite of showy. She sat a horse the way she moved through the camp, with the total body economy of someone who had never been taught to perform anything for an audience. Once, over the course of that day's riding, she turned and looked back along the line of travel. Her eyes found me, or perhaps they merely passed over me, and then she turned forward again. I told myself that was nothing. I had some practice at that kind of telling. We stopped in a canyon as the day's heat crested. The canyon walls threw shade, and the creek at the bottom ran cold over smooth stones, and I was untied and allowed to drink directly from it, which was, I do not have a word for what it was. After 3 days of dependence, moving water I could cup in both hands was a complicated kind of joy. Naylin was downstream, filling vessels with 2 other women. They spoke to each other in low voices, occasionally laughing at something I couldn't hear clearly. The laugh startled me, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it contained. There was nothing guarded in it, nothing performed. It was the laugh of someone entirely at ease with the people around her, comfortable in her own circumstances, finding something genuinely funny in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I had spent 3 days afraid of these people. Not trembling, performative fear, I was past that, but the low, cold kind. The kind that makes the shoulders tight and the jaw ache from clenching. Hearing her laugh, I noticed that my shoulders had dropped. I noticed this, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I went back to watching the water. On the 4th night, I was moved. Not to better circumstances, just different ones. Less the feeling of a prisoner in a camp, more the feeling of a problem that had been assigned to a particular person to manage. The person, it became clear, was Naylin. I was given a space near her fire. Not inside the family group, there was a clear delineation I could feel even without understanding its structure, but adjacent. Near enough for supervision. Far enough for propriety, I supposed, though I was the wrong person to interpret the nuances of Apache domestic arrangement. I was given a blanket. Actual wool, trade goods probably, worn but warm. I took it with both hands and said thank you in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and a word in Apache I'd heard used in what seemed to be contexts of gratitude. And Naylin watched me say all 3 versions, and then said something to the woman beside her in a tone that I was fairly certain constituted gentle mockery of my linguistic effort. I didn't mind. Being mocked meant being noticed. Being noticed meant being real to them, which was safer than being abstract. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and watched the fire and thought about being 26 years old and entirely uncertain, whether I would survive this, and somehow not being as afraid as I felt I should be. The 5th day, the assessor came to me again, and this time the conversation was longer. His Spanish was more fluid than I'd previously measured, and I understood that he had been calibrating it to what he believed my comprehension level was, a sophisticated piece of intelligence gathering disguised as a language barrier. He told me, and I understood perhaps 60% of this directly, the rest reconstructed from context, that the question of what to do with me had been discussed, that I was not a soldier, not a surveyor, not a traitor, that I had no obvious value as a hostage because no one would come for me. I said yes, that was correct. He said that made me, in their current calculation, a difficulty without obvious resolution. I said I understood. He said, La Mujertine uner idea. The woman has an idea. I looked across the fire to where Nayland was working, her back to us, apparently entirely occupied with whatever she was doing. I said, what idea? The assessor's expression did something I could not quite read. Not quite amusement, not quite pity. Something between the two that I would later recognize as the look of a man who has seen a particular kind of story before and is watching it begin again. He said, she will tell you herself. And he walked away. She came to me that evening. Not at dusk, as she usually did, but later, after the fires had burned down and the camp had settled into the specific quiet of people sleeping in open country, that alert stillness that isn't quite silence. She sat across from me. The embers gave enough light to see her face, which had the same quality it always had. Fully inhabited, nothing hidden but nothing particularly offered either. She said in her careful, deliberate English, you cannot go back. I waited. Not now, they will think you have given information, your people. She seemed to search for the next words. They will not trust you after this time. I had thought about this. More than I'd admitted to myself, I had thought about this. There was truth in what she was saying, not universal truth, but enough. A man who came back from Apache captivity in 1871 with all his fingers intact and no visible wounds came back with questions trailing him that never fully went away. What are you suggesting? I said. She looked at me steadily. Stay, she said. I waited for the rest of the sentence. No rest came. Stay, I said, as what? She was quiet for a moment, choosing words, I thought, from a small inventory of available ones. Then she said, marry me. The fire crackled. Something in the middle distance, a coyote, probably, opened and closed a brief conversation with the dark. I sat very still. Marry you, I said. Yes. Why? She considered this with the same unhurried seriousness with which she considered everything. I will tell you, she said, when you decide. She stood, walked back toward her side of the fire. Lay down, it seemed, because I could no longer see her. I sat there for a very long time. I did not sleep that night. I am not certain I had slept fully on any night since my capture, but this was a different kind of wakefulness. Not the hypervigilance of a man in danger, but the specific alertness of a man who has been handed a question so large and strange that his mind simply refuses to put it down. Marry me. I turned the words over the way you turn a stone in a river, looking for what's underneath, looking for the thing the surface doesn't show. I had grown up in Missouri, the fourth of 6 children in a family that understood marriage as a contract negotiated between families with practical considerations at its center, land, labor, the particular economies of survival. Love, when it came, was not the engine of the thing. It was what sometimes grew in the soil afterward if the soil was right. So I understood proposals as practical instruments. I understood that she had not said I love you because that wasn't what was being offered. Something was being offered, but it wasn't that. What I couldn't work out was, what was it? At some point before dawn, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat with my back against the rough scrub oak at the edge of the camp and watched the sky change. It does something particular in the high desert before sunrise. The darkness doesn't retreat evenly, it thins in patches, and the stars in the west hold longer than they should, stubborn and bright, while the east turns colors that have no names in English. Copper. Rose. A specific shade of pale gold that I have seen since, in paint on old church walls, and which the painters always got slightly wrong. I thought about Missouri, about the Harmon Ranch, about the specific texture of my life before the horse had spooked and thrown me into a dry wash and delivered me by a series of mishaps that felt in retrospect almost deliberate to this place. It was not a life I was desperate to return to. That was the thing I had to be honest about, sitting there in the dark, not desperate. It was a decent life, fair work, fair pay, men I liked well enough, country I respected. But decent had never felt like enough. I had never been able to name what enough would look like, which had kept me moving, kept me taking the next ranch and the next range and the next fence line, searching for something I couldn't articulate. A man with no particular place to return to is more dangerous to himself than he knows, because when something strange is offered, he can't measure it against what he'd be losing. He can only measure it against the open question that his life already is. She was awake before anyone else. I had expected this somehow. I think I had understood from observation that she was a particular kind of person, the kind who meets the day at its beginning rather than waiting for it to arrive. She emerged from her sleeping place and began moving through the quiet camp with purposeful efficiency, building up the fire, checking on something in a clay vessel left near the coals overnight. She didn't look at me. I watched her with the attention I had been giving everything in this camp for 5 days, which was the attention of someone with nothing else to do and everything to learn. But this morning, the attention had a different quality. I was looking at her the way I would look at a decision I had already half-made, looking for evidence that the half-decision was right or wrong. She crouched by the fire and the dawn light came across her face from the left, and in that particular moment I saw something I hadn't seen in the evenings, in the firelight, in the flatlit middays. She looked tired, not physically tired, the other kind, the kind that comes from carrying something for a long time without setting it down. I thought, there is something this is solving for her, and I don't know what it is. She brought me breakfast. She untied my wrist. The ritual was the same, had been the same since the first evening, one hand free, the other still secured, and set down food and went a few feet away and sat. After a while I said, "You said you'd tell me why when I decide." "You have decided. I'm working toward it." She looked at me with that steady, measuring quality. "What do you need to decide?" "I need to understand what it means," I said. "What you're offering, what you're asking." She thought about this for a longer time than I expected, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "My husband died 1 year ago." She said it carefully, the way someone says something in a learned language they want to make sure lands correctly. "He was a good man, he was killed." A pause. "There are things a woman alone has difficulty doing alone, not impossible." But she made a gesture with one hand that I couldn't interpret precisely but understood to mean complicated, costly, the kind of difficult that compounds over time. "You need a practical arrangement," I said. "Yes, then not only that." "What else?" "Someone who will try," she said, "to understand." It was such a simple thing to ask for, such an enormous thing to ask for, the same request depending on how you held it. I asked her that morning what had happened to her husband. She told me. I will not write what she told me here because it is not my story to reduce to summary. What I will say is that it involved soldiers and a raid and a specific morning in spring, and a decision her husband had made, a brave decision, a fatal one that had kept others alive. That the grief in her voice when she described it was not theatrical. That she told it the way people tell things they have told before, many times, until the telling has worn grooves in them, worn the rawness down to something they can carry without bleeding. I sat with it after she finished, with the weight of it. Then I said, "What was his name?" She looked at me, something in her expression shifted slightly, as if the question had been unexpected. "Chahal," she said. "Chahal," I repeated badly. Something moved across her face that I couldn't name then and can name now. She was deciding whether I was worth the vulnerability of being corrected. She corrected me, said the name again slowly with the emphasis and the throat sound I had mangled. I said it again, still badly but better. She nodded once. I asked the assessor, whose name I had by then been given. Goyakla, though that was not the name he used casually, and I would not use it casually here. I asked him, in our halting Spanish, what my options were from the perspective of the band. He said without hesitation that there were 3. I could be kept as labor until I was no longer useful, at which point my fate would depend on circumstances. I could be ransomed if I had family or employer willing to pay, though he had assessed this as unlikely. Or I could stay, properly, with a place in the structure of the band. He said the third option was unusual, not unheard of. He said there had been others, Mexicans mostly, some Americans, who had made a life this way, by choice or by the slow accumulation of circumstance. He said it required learning. He said it required proving over time that you were not a danger and not a liability. He said, and his expression held that same complicated quality as before, not quite amusement, not quite pity, that Nayland had vouched for me in the discussion about options. She doesn't know me, I said. He said, she knows how you eat. I didn't follow that. He seemed to consider whether to explain, and then decided to. He said, when someone is given food and they eat as if they're ashamed of needing it, they are proud in a way that makes them dangerous. When someone eats as if they're trying to prove they don't need anything from you, that is also dangerous. But when someone eats like a person who is simply hungry and accepts what is given without performance, that is a person who can be in a place honestly. He said she had watched me eat on the first night and told him, this one is hungry and not ashamed and not performing. She had said this before she'd said anything else about me. I sat with that for a moment. That's why she brought me food herself, I said. She wanted to see, he said. I made my decision that afternoon. It was not a dramatic moment. I did not weigh the scales and hear some celestial balancing. I was sitting in the shade of the canyon wall with my one free hand lying open in my lap, watching a lizard move across the hot rock above me with perfect confidence, and I thought, what if the thing I've been looking for wasn't a place but a particular kind of life? And what if I've been walking past it for years? And what if the horse spooked for a reason? That last thought was foolish, and I knew it was foolish, and I held it anyway, because sometimes foolish is the closest thing to honest. I thought about Chahal, a man I had never met who had made a brave decision and died for it, and left behind a woman who described him with the specific grief of someone who had loved something real. I thought about what it would mean to step into that space, not to replace it, because you cannot replace what was real, but to be something different, something new. A different kind of arrangement, built on the particular terms two strangers could agree to when they were both, in their separate ways, without a clear path home. I thought I could try. I had never in my life tried anything as deliberately as this. I had drifted into jobs, drifted between places, made decisions by the accumulation of small inactions. This would be a decision, an active one, taken with full awareness of how little I understood and how much I would need to learn. I thought that might be the point. She was near the creek when I found her. Alone, for once, the other women had gone back up to the camp with the filled vessels, and she had stayed to wash something in the current, kneeling on a smooth stone with her hands in the cold water. I came and stood nearby, not too close. She looked up. I said yes. She looked at me for a long moment. The water moved around her hands. The canyon wall held the last of the afternoon heat against us like something cupped. You understand what yes means, she said. Not a question, more a requirement. I understand I don't understand most of it, I said, and I'll understand more if I stay. She was quiet. I'm not him, I said. I know that. No, she said, you are not. No gentleness in it, no cruelty either, just the fact. Is that a problem? I asked. She thought about it. Actually considered it. The way I was learning, she considered everything, without performance, without the social lubricant of a quick reassurance. No, she said at last, different is not the same as less. She went back to washing what was in her hands. I stood there for another moment, not certain if the conversation was over. Then she said without looking up, you will need a name. I have a name. Another one, she said, one that means something here. What will it mean? She considered the water. I will think, she said, it should be earned. I stood in the failing afternoon light and watched the creek run over the stones and thought, yes, it should. Everything worth having should be. The band's recognition of the arrangement was not what I had imagined, though I had not known what I was imagining until I saw what actually happened. There was no ceremony exactly, no formal pronouncement. What there was, a gradual, visible shift in the way the camp related to me. The stake was not set the following morning. My remaining restraint was removed without comment by a younger man who handed me in its place a task, carrying water from the creek to the camp in the pre-dawn. A job, a contribution, a place in the labor structure of the band. The boy who had brought me water on the first day appeared at my elbow while I was figuring out the vessels and showed me, with patient 10-year-old efficiency, the correct way to balance two of them without spilling. He did not acknowledge that this was the same boy who had set a clay cup in the dirt beside my face 3 days ago and waited for me to lower myself to drink from it. Neither did I. That, I was learning, was its own kind of generosity. Nayland did not change toward me all at once. I had not expected that she would. What changed was smaller, incremental, the way she told me things, not explaining herself, but acknowledging that I was present and might not know what she knew. On the third morning of my new status, she handed me a length of rope and said, in English, "Picket line." And when I had clearly picketed the horse in the way I knew, which was not her way, she watched, waited, and then said, "Again, I'll show you." She showed me. I did it again. She examined it without touching it. "Better," she said, "not right, better." I said that was probably accurate as a description of my general situation. She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, not a smile exactly, but the preconditions of one, the terrain that smiling happens on. She said in Apache something I didn't understand. Then, seeing my expression, "It means someone who tries badly but keeps trying. We have a word." "Is it a compliment?" "Not entirely," she said, "but not." She walked away. I stood holding the rope and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, that I might be in the right place. Spring came to that country the way it always came, not gently, but with intention. The desert doesn't bloom like the places I had known before. There is no slow warming, no gradual greening. One morning the Ocotillo is bare red wands against a white sky, and the next morning, sometimes literally the next morning, it is wearing crimson flowers that look like something a man lit on fire and forgot to put out. The brittle bush turns gold overnight. The prickly pear swells with something it has been holding all winter and then opens it, all at once, a color between yellow and orange that I do not have a name for in any language I speak. I had been with the band for 4 months by then. I had not stopped counting the days, but I had started counting them differently, not as days until something, but as days of something. It is a subtle shift, and it takes longer than you'd think to notice you've made it. My Apache was still rough. It would be rough for a long time yet, but I had moved past the stage of total linguistic incompetence into something I thought of as functional poverty. I could express need, acknowledge instruction, participate in the surface of conversation even when the depths ran past me. The boy, whose name I had learned was Daishi, had appointed himself my teacher in the way that 10-year-olds appoint themselves to positions of authority, completely, without consultation, with total confidence in their own qualifications. He was an excellent teacher, merciless and precise. The name question had not been resolved. I had learned that names among the Chiricahua were not static things. They were earned and sometimes changed and sometimes multiplied, and a name given too quickly was a name that might not fit later and would therefore be a kind of small dishonesty. Nayland had said she would think about it, and I had observed that she did things slowly and thoroughly, and so I had waited. In the meantime, I was called variations of my own name by most of the band, Caleb, or sometimes just a gesture that meant the one we're talking about, and by Nayland herself I was called, most often, nothing. She had a way of addressing me without a name that was not impersonal. It was specific. It meant, "You, exactly you, I know which one you are without needing to label you." I thought about this more than was probably appropriate. The trouble came in late spring, from the direction I should have expected but didn't, because I had stopped expecting trouble from that direction. A man came looking for me. Not Harmon. Harmon had, as I'd predicted, moved on. The man who came was named Trent Caswell, and he was a deputy from a town I had passed through on my way to the Harmon Ranch, and he was not looking for me specifically. He was looking for information, for any captives being held, for any indication of the band's location, for the kind of intelligence that precedes the kind of military action that the territory had been conducting, sporadically and disastrously, for years. I don't know how he found the camp. I suspect he didn't find it so much, as he was allowed to approach closely enough to be a problem, and the band made the decision to deal with him before he could deliver his information to anyone. He was brought in at midday, bound as I had been, on foot as I had been. He looked at me across the camp with the expression of a man who has just seen something he doesn't have a category for. I looked back. I sat with him that afternoon because Goyakla asked me to, and because I understood, without it being stated, that I was being asked to play a particular role here, and that how I played it would matter for everything. He was maybe 35, this deputy. A practical-looking man, not unkind in his face. The kind of man who had a job and did it, and didn't trouble himself much about the complications around its edges. He looked at me with a combination of relief and confusion that told me exactly what he was thinking. Here is a white man. I have been saved. He will help me. You've been held here long, he said, low voice, meaning are they listening? I haven't been held, I said, not for a while. He looked at me. I said, I live here. I have a place here. He stared at me for a long time, long enough that I could watch him reassemble his understanding of the situation, which took some effort because the new picture didn't fit neatly over the old one. You've gone native, he said, not with contempt exactly, with the tone of a man who has encountered something he has heard of but didn't quite believe. I've made a life, I said. There's a difference. The army won't see a difference. The army doesn't know I'm here. I do, he said, and there it was. The threat and the problem and the moral weight of the situation all compressed into 2 words. I went to Nayland that night. She was sitting outside her wickiup with a fire between us, and I came and sat across from her without being invited, which I had learned was acceptable. We had built over 4 months a set of understandings, some spoken, most not, about the geography of our arrangement, where I was welcome and where I wasn't, what I could ask and what I should wait for. It was not an easy geography to learn, and I had made mistakes in it, and she had corrected them with the same direct patience. She corrected the picket line and the water carrying and my pronunciation of every Apache word I attempted. I said, the deputy, what happens to him? She was quiet. Nayland, decisions like that are not mine, she said. But you have an opinion. She looked at me. I always have an opinion. What is it? She stoked the fire, watched the sparks rise. He's not a soldier, she said at last. A deputy is not the same as a soldier. He came looking not to make war. That's a distinction that might get lost, I said. Yes, we sat with that. If they decide to, I started. I know, she said. I know what you are going to say. What am I going to say? That you can't stay here if they harm someone who came looking, not fighting. I hadn't known that was what I was going to say until she said it, but yes, that was exactly it. Is that what you want to say? She asked. I think so. She nodded slowly. Then say it, she said, to Goyakla, not to me. It might not change anything. No, she said, but you have to say what you mean, otherwise you are just, she paused, looking for the English word, decorating. I thought about that for a moment, decorating. Saying things that look like meaning but have no weight, she said. You have to speak like you will live with what happens after. I spoke to Goyakla the next morning. My Apache was still poor, but I had learned that he had patience for poor Apache when the intent behind it was honest, and I laid out my case as honestly as I could. That Caswell was not a soldier, that he had come for information and not to fight, that releasing him, perhaps misdirected, perhaps with a warning, would cost less than it saved. That killing a deputy sheriff would bring the kind of attention that killed people. Goyakla listened. His expression did not change during this. His expression almost never changed during anything, which I had learned to read as thought rather than dismissal. Then he said in Spanish, "And what do you owe him, this deputy?" I said I didn't know him, owed him nothing. Then why do you argue for him? I thought about what Nayland had said. You have to speak like you will live with what happens after. Because the kind of man I want to be here argues for him, I said. Because I can't be useful to anyone if I only speak when it costs me nothing. Goyakla was quiet for a while. Then, if we release him, he tells where we are. Not if he doesn't know exactly where we are, I said. Not if he's moved first. Another long silence. You make the escort, he said. You take him far enough. He used an Apache word I didn't know, then translated it. Confused the direction. He almost smiled, almost. He will think he went south. We will go north. I said, I can do that. He said, then do it, and he is your responsibility. I understood what that meant. I said yes. I took Caswell out 2 days later before dawn on a route that was not what he thought it was. He rode beside me and asked me questions. Who was I, really? How long? Did I want to leave? Was I a prisoner or not? And I answered some and didn't answer others, and gradually he seemed to understand that the answers he was getting were the answers he was going to get, and he stopped asking the questions that didn't have answers. At a dry fork he didn't recognize, I stopped and gave him a direction. "Southeast," I said. "You'll hit the river by afternoon, and the river leads to the settlement." He looked at me. "You're not coming." "No." "You could," he said. "Come back. Nobody'd fault you for ending up here. It happens." "I know," I said. He waited, giving me time. A decent man, Caswell. I had been right about that. "I made a choice," I said. "I'm living in it." "What kind of choice?" he said, not hostile, genuinely curious. I thought about how to explain it in the time I had, and with the words I had. I thought about juniper smoke and a bowl of food and a woman who watched how you ate and made a judgment from it that turned out to be worth something. I thought about a word in Apache that meant someone who tries badly but keeps trying and was not entirely a compliment. I thought about a name I hadn't been given yet. That was still being decided. That would mean something when it came. "The kind where you stop drifting," I said. Caswell looked at me for a moment. Nodded in the way men nod when they don't fully understand something, but they recognize it as sincere. Then he rode southeast. I watched until the scrub took him, then turned back north. Nayland was waiting at the edge of the camp when I returned. Not waiting dramatically. She was doing something with a hide, scraping, I think, and she looked up when I came over the rise and then looked back down and kept working. But she had positioned herself where she would see my return, and that was its own kind of thing. I came and stood near her, not too close, our usual distance. "He's gone," I said, "southeast toward the river." "Good." I sat down on a rock and let the tiredness of the night and the morning arrive all at once, which it did comprehensively. I was tired in the bones. Not unhappy, tired, which is different. After a while Nayland set down the hide and her tool. She turned slightly toward me. "I have thought about your name," she said. I looked at her. "You went last night to Goyakla for a man you don't know," she said, "and you took him out this morning and you came back." "Yes." "You came back," she repeated, as if this were the significant part, as if the fact of return when there had been the option of departure was a thing worth naming. "It wasn't a hard decision," I said. "All decisions where you could leave and you stay," she paused. "They are never as simple as they look when you tell them later." I had nothing to say to that. That was better than silence, so I stayed quiet. "Your name," she said. "In Apache it is." And she said a word, 2 syllables, with a sound in the middle that I would learn to make correctly over the following weeks. "What does it mean?" I said. She considered. "It means," she made a gesture with her hands, opening them. "One who returns to where he should be, one who finds north." A pause. "The way water finds low ground, not because it is forced, because it knows." I sat with that for a long moment. "Is it a compliment?" I said. "Not entirely," she said with the same quality as before, the terrain of a smile. "But not. There are things I did not know that spring that I would learn in the year following. I did not know that our arrangement would grow, slowly, into something more than practical, not into the grand romance of novels, not into the fast heat of youth, but into the specific and irreplaceable warmth of 2 people who have decided to understand each other, and are doing the work of it daily, imperfectly, without guarantees. I did not know that Daisy would become, in some functional sense, the younger brother I had never had, or that his patient and merciless instruction in Apache would eventually give me language enough to argue, and to apologize, and to tell jokes that were occasionally even funny. I did not know that I would miss Missouri less and less, and then not at all, and then, on certain nights in certain seasons, with a complicated specific ache that wasn't quite missing and wasn't quite grief, and had no word in English for it. I did not know that Nayland, in a moment I didn't anticipate, on a morning I wouldn't have predicted, 8 months after the name was given, on a cold day in early winter with snow coming down through the junipers like it had all the time in the world, would say to me, in Apache that she no longer translated because she knew I could follow it. "I think Chahal would have been curious about you." And I would not know what to say, and I would not try to say anything. And she would return to the fire, and I would stand in the falling snow and feel something in my chest that was too large for the moment and exactly the right size for it at the same time. My grandfather's journal ends 3 pages before the cedar chest does. The last entry is not dramatic. It's a list of words, Apache words, with his phonetic approximations beside them, and in the margin, small notes about context. Used when correcting someone gently, used between people who are close, used for the sky after rain. The list is not complete. It stops mid-page in the middle of a word. I used to think he'd simply run out of paper, that the story continued somewhere that the paper didn't in the lived years past the writing. Now I think he stopped on purpose, that he reached a point in the cataloging and understood that some things resist being written down, not because they're secret, not because they're shameful, but because the act of writing them down does something to them, flattens them, makes them past tense when they are still present. Some things don't translate, boy. He meant some things are still alive in me, and I will not put them in a drawer. Outside my window the flats are empty, the same sky he watched or one very like it, the same light that finds north without being told. I fold the journal and put it back in the cedar chest, and for a moment I can smell the pine tar and the dried sage.